Welcome Internet to a Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing Hikikomori, a book written by Saitō Tamaki, a Japanese psychiatrist, and translated by Jeffrey Hengels. I hope I said those names right. So this book is going to tackle the subject of Hikikomori, i.e. people who are in a social withdrawal. So for Saito, he described it in the late 90s, and this book was written in 98. So basically it's also a testament to its era, because there's a lot of topics that are only touched upon but would be much wider now, like the use of internet, those connections through the wide web, and so on and so forth. So very fundamentally, this book is going to talk about what causes and also how to remediate social withdrawal. But first, Saito is going to explain what it is. For him, social withdrawal could be characterized as a form of withdrawal in the family home, because what Saito explains is that most of the people he's met were adolescents, and the withdrawal started in adolescence. He hasn't met, at least in his experience, people who started withdrawing beyond 30. So he sees it as an adolescent process, even though it might happen in the 20s or early 20s or even late 20s. It's still, for Saito, something that has to do with development, because his big premise is that fundamentally people who are in withdrawn states are unable on their own to grow, to mature to a position of adulthood. And he's going to go into details on how this happens. He says that very fundamentally these people withdraw gradually, slowly but surely. That they might start off skipping school, not going to social events, and it's going to worsen. And that's one of the main axes of the book. It's that the state of withdrawalness does not go away by itself. It needs therapeutic help. And when he means therapeutic, it's very interesting because it doesn't just mean psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. What he means is the whole process of having a social understanding, of having clubs dedicated to Hikikomori people, spaces where they can meet each other. So for him, it's not about we should just take the individual and rehabilitate them. No, it's much more subtle and much more complicated, as we will see later on. So for him, the starting point of Hikikomori is when the individual withdraws and stays withdrawn for a period of 6 months. Why 6 months? Well, very simply, Saito says that fundamentally, if we are to understand Hikikomori, we have to understand it as something that has lasted a certain while, because it doesn't want to pathologize people who, for example, have experienced something hard or something traumatic, and that withdraw because they are lost, at least for a certain time. He says that the Hikikomori state is a much more permanent, much more at risk of being chronic state. And what he's going to say is that he's going to shatter a lot of a prioris and cliches that we might have on people who are withdrawn. Mainly that they're lazy, that they don't want to get help, that they're basically passive. He just breaks that all down, saying that they are not lazy and they are suffering. They would want to go out into the world, to enjoy the world, but they can't. They feel stuck and blocked. And he says that feeling of being stuck and blocked is such an issue that often the individual is like frozen in time. And he rightly points out that who's going to take on the individual and try and help them is the family. And often the family is at loss, because things were not like that earlier on in Japanese culture. So he says that it's a relatively new symptom, at least it was in the 90s. So therefore, this condition had to be helped in a very different way. So the family is often stuck with the individual, and they might try things like motivate the individual, have a stern talk on how to deal with life, and so on and so forth. But what Saito explains is that this is going to be ineffective, because the individual is already feeling a lot of guilt. So putting a layer of guilt upon that does not help. And he's right, in general, that when you're having a mental health issue, You're not going to be helped by a sturdy talk with a fatherly figure, right? That happens in the movies, but not in real life. And he points that out, and that's very true. The other important aspect is that he says that often the people who are withdrawn are not seeking help directly, that they very rarely go and see a therapist or go and see a psychiatrist or go and see an institution. So it's often the families that come to the institutions. Problem is that often the institutions, we tell them that we can't help them if the individual is not willing to seek help. But he says that in the case of social withdrawal, that's a mistake. Because what is happening is that the families are the first interface. They're the ones that basically have direct contact with the individual, and that they need as much help as the Hikikomori. And for him to help the Hikikomori, you have to help the family. Those go together, right? So his idea is that you should always take in the family and try and have a conversation with them. So he says that there's more or less two versions of Hikikomori. A version in which it's relatively recent, therefore it's more easily accessible. That he says that it's a good thing if, for example, they still are studying or they haven't lost their place in high school or university, because it's easier to go back to those. He says it's much harder once the situation has installed itself over a long period of time. There's also, at least what he pointed out in the 90s, is that there's often a misunderstanding that professionals, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, will label social withdrawal with something else. For example, if the individual has a fear of others, they might say anthropophobia, i.e. the fear of others, but they're not going to name the withdrawal state. So the state is not going to be characterized. And he says this is a mistake. You have to focus on the state of withdrawal, on how it affects the individual, but also the family. Also, he says that the longer this state of withdrawal goes on, the more secondary symptoms are going to appear. Like, for example, obsessive-compulsive disorder. That the individual might not start as obsessive, but have those symptoms as it goes. Because as they're losing control over themselves, they might be over-controlling through rituals, through tidiness, and so on and so forth. Also, and in more extreme cases, they can even be controlling of the family members of, you don't do this, you don't do that, you do this, you do that, and so on and so forth. He might also say that sometimes they might have psychotic hallucinations or delusions, but he says that contrary to schizophrenia, for example, that schizophrenia is much harder to understand. The delusions on a surface level don't have that much meaning. In the state of Hikikomoris, they have meaning, that they feel so isolated that they fear other people will judge their physique. It's much more easily understandable that it's a fear of being judged by others, of being having that negative interaction. Because what Saitō points out is that when you're interacting with others, there's always going to be a certain level of displeasurable events, of little traumas, or what we now call microaggressions, that will happen regardless of who you are, ethnicity, minority. Even if you're, let's say, part of the majority, there's still always microaggressions in interactions, and we can't avoid it. But that's what the withdrawal individual is afraid of, is terrified of, is those microaggressions, because they don't feel that they can survive it. So, very interestingly enough, you might be wondering, so isn't it a problem of education? Haven't the parents done the job well or not sufficiently well? Well, Saitō explicitly states that if we should not go on the victim blaming or parent blaming road, because what happens is that trying to find a cause like this, even though it might be accurate, it might, right? It's not 100% the case, and one should never try and find a causal link in blaming someone, except it is evident trauma. But most hikikomoris, very interesting enough, have not experienced child abuse. They haven't been beaten, they haven't been belittled, they haven't been humiliated. What he points out is often they haven't been. So therefore, this causal link that we are prone to do as therapists, this symptom, therefore bad family, shouldn't be done. At least for Saitō, it's very important to try and encourage the families to have a good form of communication. So for him, it is incredibly important to help the families, because he's going to conceptualize it as a hikikomori system, meaning that the individual is part of it, but there's another part which is the family. the family is often at loss, and he says that the family feels a lot of shame. Therefore, they're not going to talk about it. For example, if the father or the mother is working, they might never talk to their colleagues about their reclused son or daughter because they feel ashamed of this, that this should not have happened. They might even start blaming themselves that I am to blame. I should have done this in their childhood. I should have done that. And this only severs the system. The system only withdraws within itself. So it's not just the individual that is withdrawn. He's the top of the iceberg. The parents also start to withdraw. They see less friends. They don't invite the friends to the home. They might be afraid of having work done in the home because of this form of shame, and so on and so forth. So for him, the whole point of Saitō is that to alleviate that shame, they need to talk about it. Therefore, there needs to be groups for people with Hikikomori children. And also, they have to be able to talk about it with their Hikikomori child. To be able to have not a stern, not a tough love conversation, but a real, true, heart-to-heart conversation in which one really listens to the complaints of the child without giving in, without saying, you're right, I should have done this, you're right, you should have that, I'm so sorry, and so on and so forth. But everyone should be able to talk and give their opinion. No one should be silenced. No one should be cut out of the conversation. And it's also very important for Saitō that the child that is in a Hikikomori state shouldn't be a tyrant. They should not dictate what the family will do or has to do. For him, everyone should have their place in the family system. And through those talks, often what happens is that the child, slowly but surely, can sometimes rekindle a relationship with society. And very interestingly enough, he says that often when families come to psychotherapy for the Hikikomori child, the Hikikomori child might be very distant, might refuse to go. But it shouldn't be a deterrent. The family should still come. And he says that throughout those repeated interactions, throughout the fact that, for example, the family is going to be happy with the therapist, the child might start being interested in who's that person they're talking to, what's so great about their advice, and be more curious and be more willing to go. He also says that you shouldn't force them to come, like you shouldn't drag them out. You should not also, pressure them to come. They come if they want to come. Even if it takes time, there's going to be a point where they're going to want to go, just to see who everyone's always talking about, right? A form of curiosity. Also, he makes a lot of this very interesting distinctions between other forms of mental illnesses. So for him, it's not really depression, because the Hikikomori isn't depressed per se. Also, their state is not helped by any medication. Secondly, it's not schizophrenia, because their delusions are more understandable and tend to resolve themselves once one understands and once they're no longer in the Hikikomori state. They're no longer necessarily borderline because they might not have that quick oscillation. They're also, for him, not quite schizoid because they're not always, alexithymia. They don't always have alexithymia. They can express their emotions. They can be very emotional at times. And they also can be basically in good contact with their families, meaning in close contact. He also states that even though it is rare, there might be cases of violence in the Hikikomori family. And he says that it's very important to be able in those moments to protect themselves, that the parents must protect themselves, So fundamentally, he says that in those moments, violence isn't acceptable, and that you should not treat it with love, but with kindness. So the difference he makes is that love is an emotion where there's this eternal forgiveness, that in a way for the parent, the son or the daughter is every sin, so they're going to forgive, they're going to try and do their most, they're going to try and comply with every demand, even sometimes going for costly cosmetic surgery because the child feels that they will then be able to present in society because they'll be attractive. Spoiler alert, that never works out according to Saitō. And then what happens is that the child might escalate, there might be an escalation, of basically bad behavior being violence, insults, and so on and so forth. So for him, it's very important to protect oneself and to not let that happen. He says that, again, it's easier if it's early behavior, that you catch it early, easier to treat. If you catch it late, much harder, but it is possible. But it sometimes requires leaving the home and for an extended period of time, right? It's not easy. But he says that you have to be diligent, but you cannot be zealot, right? You can't do things in excess. Like you can't, if for example it doesn't work out with a therapist or with a club, you can't, or in an institution, you can't be jumping from one to another in, let's say, a month. These things, and he's very explicit about this, take a lot of time. You need to build a good rapport. You need to basically have a whole system that is built and a whole framework, and that takes a lot of time. Now, very interestingly enough, for him, this problem isn't solely Japanese, because we might have this impression that this only concerns Japan. It's not the case. It concerns a lot of countries, and including European countries. He says that the only difference is we don't categorize it like that, and he's right, we often don't. When there's a state of withdrawal, we try and see what pathology has caused it rather than seeing the state of withdrawal itself. So very interesting. And very fundamentally, he says that there's also a big difference, is that we in Europe, or at least in the 90s, if there was a child like that, the parents would kick him out, but they would end up homeless. So for him, it shouldn't be like the withdrawal is purely culturally Japanese, but that same withdrawal could happen in the West if we let the children be withdrawn. But he says that if you kick them out, they often end up homeless. So he says, is that really better? And that's a good question. I don't think it's that better or even great. At least in the Hikikomori state, they're at least not hurt by other people, which is the case when you're homeless. There's much more risk of abuse. So again, very interesting perspective. He also, intriguingly enough, makes it known, right, that the state in of itself is not going to heal by itself. So it needs a whole development. And for him, the fact of taking care is multi-layered. It's going to see the psychologist, going to see the psychiatrist, going to clubs, talking to other people. And he says that if the withdrawal individual basically has a love affair with someone, that's incredibly good sign. That means that it's partly way out, because the individual loves and can then love someone else. He also says that there's a risk of regression in the Hikikomori state, that these people that are adults, like in their 20s, might regress to a more infantile behavior, sometimes even waking up their moms, touching their moms' bodies, kicking their moms, playing a form of infantile play when they will hit the floor with their foot to say that they're not happy, and so on and so forth. And he says that this is very important for the parent to be able to have their own life, to not do what the child is expecting of them. Because it's important for him, and this is, I completely agree, that there is no disavow of castration. So he talks about it at the very tail end of the book, because he says that the main issue with the Hikikomori is that they themselves feel immense suffering. They often live contrary to the rules of society, i.e. they spend all their time sleeping during the day and then at night being active, that they in a way are not engaging in society in a physical way. So for him there's a disavowal, because in a way the Hikikomori is not renouncing to any of their possibilities. They're in a way freezing time and freezing their abilities. And the issue is that if one tries to be a good parent, right, or the stereotypical idea of the good parent that basically do everything for them, what you're doing is that you're preserving the state of disavowal of castration, meaning that they're not making any choices, they're not renouncing. And for him that's very important, that participating in society is a renouncement. You're renouncing a lot of things when you're partaking in the whole of culture, right? So very importantly for him, this idea of having two very separate lives helps the Hikikomori see that A, he's an individual that can fend for himself, and B, that the parents have their own lives, that their time is valuable and important. Therefore, it needs to things need to be separated. So very, very interesting idea. And likewise, he explains that fundamentally, if this goes on too long, if, for example, the Hikikomori goes beyond 30, so he uses 30 as like a cut-in line, that things need to be renegotiated because time has passed and opportunities have gone. Therefore, there should be a real talk on if the individual should be, how can I say, considered disabled with a mental disability, and not like intellectual but psychic, like, for example, schizophrenia, let's say. And he says that this is important because when they reach 30 and 40, the parents are already old and elderly. And by that point, he says that going back into the society is complicated because you've lost a lot of opportunities and you're no longer in the time frame of doing studies, of being employed, of doing this and that and that. So he says that there should be a real talk on what's going to happen next when the parent passes. And this is a very important topic because once, at least in France it's a bit the same, right? There's a disability allowance that helps people with disabilities survive. And it's true that these are administrative processes, so it's important to take them early because they take a lot of time to be put in place. And I assume, and this is only speculation on my end, that it's the same in Japan, that there's a lot of time for that, for it to really happen. So he says that it's very important to have these conversations and to recognize that at this point it is a disability, that it's not going to go away like that, and to accept it as something that's chronic. But beforehand, we can try everything to try and mobilize the individual. And of course, he's not saying that beyond 30 it's over. Not at all, but he says it's much, much, much harder. So very fundamentally, Saitō is trying to paint a broad picture in order for us to be able to intervene as quickly as possible. When I mean us, I mean mental health professionals on the whole. This picture that he brushes is important because often it is undermined by the fact that they're hidden. The Hikikomoris are hidden from the rest of society, so we're not seeing them, we're not experiencing them because we're not seeing them. And even as therapists, it's relatively rare to get people that are in complete states of withdrawal, which leads us, and when I mean us, I mean mental health professionals and even French professionals, as he asked the question to a French psychologist and said, no, it's purely Japanese, we in France don't have them. This is wrong, it's just that we don't see them. And I think that by bringing up this topic, he's allowing the individuals that do suffer from these states to be able to connect to this word of Hikikomori, to be able to have an identity. And this is where I think the book would benefit from an addendum right now because of the internet. Because in the 90s, even though there was an internet, it was not the internet we have now. Meaning that fundamentally it has changed things immensely. Because what you have to understand with the Hikikomori is even if they can't or cannot participate in society physically, they can participate through the internet. And I think it's purely speculative, but I really do believe this, that it has changed things massively because now they can engage, they can talk, they can have friends, they can see what's happening in the world, whereas they were limited to TV before, which is a more passive experience. Right now, through the internet, they can engage. So I would be very curious to see what Saitō thinks of this modern era of Hikikomori. Has it changed something? Is it the same? And so on and so forth. So, very fundamentally, this is pretty much it for the book. Of course, the book is much more rich than what these 20-ish minutes have shown you, but the idea is that Hikikomori is a state that we should understand as bigger than just one psychopathology or one mental illness. It's a state that doesn't go on its own, so therefore it's important to catch it early to be able to help as soon as one can. Communication is key. Not lying, not being deceitful, being hopeful, but not to the extent of self-sacrifice, is what helps the Hikikomori. Of course, there's professional opinions and things that need to be sought out, but it's important to try and get help, to not feel ashamed, to be able to verbalize all of what is happening, both for the individual and for their families. and to basically not feel a crushing sense of guilt, because these things can happen. The whole perspective is to try and help the best we can. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found it interesting. If you want to add anything or say anything in the comments, feel free to do so. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.